to set the stage very briefly for this amazing discussion that's about to take place. And you may have noticed that there's a bench right beside me, and I want to especially thank our team member Alistair Reed for getting this beautiful bench made from BC spruce from a sustainable forest. And this looks as much as we could get it to look like as the original friendship bench in Zimbabwe, which you're going to hear all about now. It's not only about the bench itself and about the connectedness and healing that can happen on a bench, but also there's a great deal of pedagogy about it. Now, what I want to share with you is, how did this bench get to be here, other than the fact that it was moved from over there to here within the last hour? I got to meet Dixon Chibanda, whom you're about to meet formally. He's been with us these last days. I got to meet Dixon at the World Economic Forum earlier this year because there was a bench there, and I thought, what is that? And I got to learn about this friendship bench. So what surprised me the most was that this bench started with a grant from Grand Challenges Canada. And in a minute, you're going to meet Jocelyn Mackie, co-CEO of Grand Challenges Canada, who will talk to you about that. I just knew not only that my favorite shape is a circle, but that we had the potential for a full circle moment here to bring this bench home to Canada and to bring this program here. So really, I mean, I happen to be a Canadian, and our team happens to be mostly made in Canada, but that this is really yours. This is really yours. And in terms of how it all started, and really, it's Dixon's and this amazing vision that he had. So I just wanted to let you know the context, because I think context is very important, and to say that this bench, thanks to Jeff Cape and his colleagues here at Evergreen Brickworks, the bench is going to live here on the grounds permanently with I want you to come read what's on the plaque, but really you're going to be talking about it anyway. But we're going to have, thanks to Grand Challenges, has very kindly offered to support the design and the cost of a beautiful plaque that will explain the whole story, so that when people go by, they don't just understand that this looks like a nice place to sit, which is fine, but that there's a meaning to this, and that hopefully we'll have friendship benches all around the country and all around the world. I'm now going to call on my colleague, Vino, to come and introduce Jocelyn to get this panel started. Thank you.
All right. So yes, I just want to say a little bit more about this person that played such a key role in making this friendship bench possible. Jocelyn Mackie is co-chief executive officer of Grand Challenges Canada, where together with her co-CEO, Carly Silver, she provides leadership and oversight to all aspects of the organization. I will let her speak more about the organization, but what Grand Challenges Canada is an innovation for impact platform that seeds and transitions to scale scientific, social, and business innovations to improve the lives of the most vulnerable communities, with one such example of that being the Friendship Bench Project. So please join me in welcoming Jocelyn.
Dixon, come up with me. I want this to be a conversation. I will, we're going to sit on the bench. Okay, yeah. Great, good. So good. I'll start just by telling you a little bit about Grand Challenges Canada so that you understand some of the context, and then we're going to have a conversation with Dixon here today. So Grand Challenges Canada, as Vino said, thank you so much. We're an innovation platform. What does that mean? We fund and support innovators, change makers, people with great ideas from around the world who have an idea on how to change their communities and the challenges that they and their communities are facing. So we are funded by the Government of Canada. I like everyone to know that, because for Canadians, it's a very proud thing that our government has invested in a platform like this. And we started in development, mostly in global health. So how can smart, often young innovators in low and middle income countries be given the opportunity to test their ideas and to fail? Part of innovation is about failing, about trying new things, given the opportunity to fail. And so we've funded over 1,200 innovations in over 90 countries around the world. Innovations in maternal, newborn, and child health. Innovations about saving moms and babies around the time of birth. Innovations in our program called Saving Brains, which I thought was quite relevant to the conversation this morning, all about early childhood development, around nutrition, around stimulation, so that the brains of the babies in low and middle income countries can grow in the way that they are meant to, so that they can be giving humans later in life. Another pillar, so that's our development pillar, and then we've also started a program in humanitarian settings. So new ways of delivering humanitarian aid to people affected in conflict zones. And that program is funded by the government of the United States, the Dutch government, and the UK government. And most recently, we've started a platform to support Indigenous innovators, Indigenous change makers. We're starting with women, Indigenous leaders, to give them the seed capital that they need to test their ideas. So that's Grand Challenges Canada and what we do. We're obviously very focused on results, on saving and improving lives. We're also very focused on the evidence that's needed to convince decision makers out there to help these innovations scale. So I'm going to be picking up on some of these themes when we talk to Dixon. So one of the programs we're very proud of is our Global Mental Health Program. Unfortunately, we are one of the largest funders of global mental health. So while we've invested over $40 million into this program, it's just a drop in the bucket. But what's so fascinating about this program is that it's supporting local innovators in countries to test their ideas so that the good ones can go to scale. And when we talk about the word innovation, we mean, yes, some scientific and technological innovation, so doohickeys and technology, but also social innovation and business innovation. And usually the coordinated application of all three of those is where we see the biggest impact. So within our mental health program, we've supported over 90 projects working in over 30 countries. And really what matters are our change makers, our innovators, and the impact that they are having on the people on the ground. So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce Dixon Chibanda. Dixon has a PhD from University of Cape Town, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah.
Sort of. He is also a professor at the London School of Tropical Medicine, focusing on mental health. But more importantly, he is the inspiration and the leader behind the concept of the Friendship Bench. So I'm going to turn it over to Dixon to tell us a little bit about his story, about where he started, why he started, where the Friendship Bench is at, and the impact, the demonstrated impact through a double-blinded study that this intervention has had. And I think what's so fascinating, I've never really thought about our work in the context of loneliness or connectedness, but it goes through all of our programming. And so thank you so much to the leadership of the Samuel Center and to Kim for using a dialogue that is human-centered, right? And while we need innovation and we need change makers, we have to remember that at the center of it all is humans and our environment, and I think that that leadership is critical, so thank you for that. So Dixon, over to you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Actually, the Friendship Bench is really about grandmothers, and I'm simply given the honor of representing the grandmothers who do this work. Isn't it strange that in modern society we have to carry out a cluster randomized controlled trial to show that grandmothers are important in our communities? And that's kind of that's essentially what we had to do, to show the world that the work that we're doing with grandmothers is important. Why is working with grandmothers important within the context of mental health? Maybe let me start off by just highlighting why mental health is important. The World Health Organization tells us, today that depression alone is the leading cause of disability globally. Over 300 million people are affected by depression. If you think about it, every 40 seconds, someone somewhere out there is taking their own lives through suicide. And when you look at the age group between 15 to 29, suicide is a leading cause of death. So when you look at all these figures, these statistics, which are quite shocking, the other thing that is important to note is we know how to manage these conditions, but we just don't have enough people to do it, like psychiatrists. So I'm a psychiatrist, and we don't have enough psychiatrists in low and middle income countries, well, everywhere, essentially.
Let alone
we don't
Canada
have
also.
enough psychiatrists or clinical psychologists. You have a ratio of one psychiatrist to over 1 million people in Africa, for instance. And so we had to come up with innovative ways of narrowing that treatment gap. And that's where the whole concept of working with grandmothers comes into play. And it's not something that I thought of instinctively. I actually picked up this idea of working with grandmothers in a place called Ouida in Benin when I was still a junior psychiatrist working as a consultant for the World Health Organization. What was fascinating about Ouida is it's very rich in culture. It's one of the places which is really known for the slave trade, but it's also known for voodoo. It's considered to be the capital city of voodoo. And so when I was in Ouida, interestingly, I was there as a consultant with other Africans from different parts of Africa trying to formulate policies to change mental health on the African landscape, so that we improve access. And while I was there in this compound where we lived, every day I would hear these activities outside, a lot of singing, dancing, and you name it. And when I asked them what was happening, they were like, well, that's voodoo, stay away from it. I became increasingly curious about the voodoo that was happening, and eventually I found myself going out to see what was happening. And I got into this voodoo priestess hut, if you want to call it that, which had all the paraphernalia of voodoo. But what was interesting was most of the clients coming to see the voodoo priest were people suffering with different forms of mental illness. It was like an encyclopedia of psychiatry. A woman with postnatal depression, someone who's just had a convulsion, someone with conspicuous schizophrenia symptoms. And what I realized from these priests was they had this amazing ability to communicate with people. They essentially immersed themselves into the experience, into the lived experiences of the subjects that were coming to them. And it was all about storytelling, very rich, vivid stories about what people were experiencing. And so when I got back to Zimbabwe and we had a crisis, Zimbabwe is always having crises anyway. We had one of those major crises, I essentially decided, together with friends, we needed to tap into the most obvious resource that is available at community level, and that was grandmothers. Maybe I should stop there for a while. Maybe you might want to ask something, or shall I carry on?
No, keep going with your story. I think we'll let you tell your story. I'll ask one question, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. So keep going.
And so grandmothers, because when you live in the part of the world where I come from, there's so much upheaval going on. most young people leave, the professionals leave the country. In my country, we have more professionals outside the country than inside the country. And all we have, the most important resource that is left in most communities are grandmothers, because they are the custodians of the local culture and wisdom. And it was through tapping into these grandmothers, by training them in the basics of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, and making that available at community level on benches like this, which were designed by local carpenters. We have managed to reach out to thousands of people and avert suicides and treat depression on a park bench using grandmother. But what's also interesting is the cluster randomized controlled trial that we carried out showed that grandmothers were actually more effective than psychiatrists at treating depression.
Did you hear that?
And they were also much better than Prozac, at alleviating symptoms of depression. And this is a cluster randomized controlled trial, But, the irony of it all is, we had to carry out a study to prove that grandmothers are an important component of communities, And so now what we're trying to do really is to just scale this model in different parts of the world.
So maybe that's a good segue. So, in our work, we are looking for those bright ideas and those individuals who have these fabulous ideas that they want to test, often in a small context. But what we're also looking for is how can we scale these ideas for the greatest impact? And so you touched on the evidence that was needed to kind of convince. Who did you have to convince? Why, do you think? And tell us a little bit about your path to scale and some of the challenges that you faced so far to scale within Zimbabwe and beyond.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So one of the most important things, which was mentioned earlier on this morning, was measurement. How do we know that what we're doing is actually working? How do we know that the results that we are seeing are because of what we are doing? Is it not chance? Is it really the intervention that is making the difference? And that's where it becomes important to often, work with researchers. Yesterday I noticed a lot of exciting and interesting interventions and ideas that people had. I think great ideas in this room from so many of you. And I think one of the things that we all need to start thinking about is, how do we measure what we're doing? What is the impact of what we're doing? How do we know that that impact is as a result of what we are doing? So anyway, in the case of Friendship Bench, we had to carry out a cluster randomized controlled trial. And I'm not saying you have to carry out a clinical trial to prove that what you're doing works. There are many different ways of doing it, of showing that what you're doing is working. And from there, after the clinical trial, you then have to come up with a strategy how you're actually going to sell the idea to policymakers. And we have consistently used a method called the theory of change. I think a lot of you might be familiar with that. The theory of change is essentially when you bring together key stakeholders from different parts of your community, your country, and essentially build consensus around where you want to take your model. And we've used this consistently in all the different parts of the world where we've introduced Friendship Bench, including New York City, where it's currently running, in the Bronx and in Harlem, and places like Zanzibar, Malawi, more recently in Kenya, and we're preparing to go to Rwanda and Liberia. And so for scale, you have to have a systematic approach, and there are key questions before you go to scale. Who's paying at scale? Who's doing it at scale? What are you taking to scale? All these critical questions need to be answered, and rule of thumb is, if you think of scale, it has to be something simple, cheap, and it has to be easy to replicate.
And so I think, what you're seeing in this kind of simple example is how Innovations from low resource settings can be transformational for our world. And I think that's something that as a Canadian, I'm quite, when I'm at forums like I was yesterday with former prime ministers and important people, I'm constantly trying to remind decision makers about the simplicity of interventions that are human focused and how we can learn from them here in more resource rich settings. The last question I want to ask you, Dixon, before I open it up, is if you could speak a little bit to the concept of stigma. And I think what I love so much about this intervention or innovation is the fact that in most places, the bench is on the front lawn outside of the community health center. And so I was in the group earlier talking about mental health institutions and the walls, and that mental health is sort of still a secret and a stigma. I think we've done a lot of work to break that down. But I've always been fascinated by the fact that this bench is out on the lawn and that these conversations are happening out in the open. And to me, that's transformational. But perhaps in your own words, you could speak to why. Why did that start on the lawn and under the tree or wherever?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So firstly, when you think of stigma, when I first started this program, my idea was to call it the mental health bench. After interacting with the grandmothers, they were like, you can't really call this the mental health bench. It won't work. And so they came up with the idea of a friendship bench because as far as the grandmothers were concerned, they are creating space for healing. They are creating space to connect with people. And you can't call it a mental health bench if you're looking at connecting. It has to have something that people can resonate with. The other thing is the language that we use. On the friendship bench, we don't give diagnosis. On the friendship bench, the key focus is to improve quality of life, improve connection. We do use algorithms which tell us what your diagnosis is, but we don't actually share it with you. Our focus, whether you're coming with schizophrenia, depression, an intellectual disability, our focus is how best can we improve the quality of your life. And so that's one way that we're taking away the stigma and the language that we use. We use locally developed terms. For instance, we don't have a word for depression. The closest that we use is kufungisisa, which literally means thinking too much. So all those things take away the stigma and they introduce a completely different platform at which you communicate as a community.
That's great. Good. Well, I would love to open it up for questions from the audience, and I'll repeat your question for you so that we can hear it. So speak as loud as you can. We'll start with this. Oh, do we have mics? Yeah. Oh, even better. I don't have to repeat. Thank you.
Vanessa King, Action for Happiness UK. So very interested in this fantastic idea. Just curious about how you selected the grandmothers and how you trained them.
That's a great question. When we got the grant from Grand Challenges Canada, by the way, and I must say, Grand Challenges Canada were the first organization to have confidence in Friendship Bench. We'd been running Friendship Bench for close to 4 years, and nobody wanted to fund Friendship Bench because they thought working with grandmothers, that's ridiculous. Until Grand Challenges came along and they were like, this is a great idea. So thank you. Your question again, what was it? Sorry.
How do you select and train?
How do we select the grandmothers?
And train. Yes.
So we have a core competency that we use. So the core competency looks at soft skills, and we also look at basic skills, the ability to read and use a mobile phone. All right, that's all we need. The soft skills are not so important, although they help us to decide who's likely to be a peer supervisor, because every human being inherently has those soft skills. We only have to teach you how to get them out. Some people already have them exposed, conspicuous, and others have them deep inside them, and we just have to help them to come out. So I think every grandmother is capable of sitting on a bench and providing therapy. So that's what we do. So we provide, we screen them, and based on that, we decide who is going to sit on the bench, who's going to be trained to be a supervisor. The training is a 1-month period. So they are trained in the the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy, which focus primarily on problem solving, behavior activation, and activity scheduling. And after that, they are allocated a park bench under supervision, where they are supervised by either a grandmother who has previously been in the program for at least 2 years, and we follow them up. Once they've seen about 10 clients, we assess if we feel they are ready to do it on their own. They then go off and they do the work on their own, and they get ongoing supervision.
And how are they paid?
Most of the grandmothers are not paid. Grandmothers who are working within the city health department get an allowance, a mobile phone allowance, because they use their mobile phones to communicate when they have difficult cases or when they have to refer to the next level. So anyone that presents with what we call a red flag, like you're suicidal, the grandmothers have to refer. Yeah.
And I think what I'll add in, because Dixon's quite modest, is how the Friendship Bench has been adopted as part of the country's approach to mental health, which I think is fascinating, and how these innovations can get picked up by governments and countries and made more systematic, and is a real sign of the success and scale that this innovation has had. Next. This lady here? Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Megan Huzzy from Special Olympics. One thing that I really love about your approach is that it's a very asset-based approach and looking at what are the things that the community has to provide rather than just looking at what it lacks. So I was wondering if you had any insights on, as people are looking at communities or trying to tackle a problem, how to kind of take that asset-based approach to adopting a theory of change.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, at least in our programs, I'll tell you that working with the Indigenous leaders in our organization, we are being very sure to take a opportunity approach rather than a deficit approach. That's not to say that we're not working with elders and leaders to acknowledge the challenges and the horrible past. But our forward-looking is all about asset-based, not deficit-based, and that's come from our leaders. And a lot of pushback, when we're fundraising or whatever. Well, we need to tell these negative stories. No, we will not do that. So I think that's the narrative that we're comfortable with, because that's what our leaders, our Indigenous leaders, have told us. And it seems to be resonating, because that's important. So that's at a platform kind of program level that we're doing, and we're using stories and success stories like innovators like Dixon. We have failures too, but we're celebrating the failures as lessons learned. And I think that language is really important, and getting our funders, which for me is the Government of Canada, we've done a lot of work to get them okay with failures as long as it's lessons based and we're learning from it and continuing. So I don't know if that touches on a bit, but that kind of language we're trying to get across all of our platforms and with the decision makers that we interact with. I don't know.
So the only thing I can add to that is communities have solutions. When you bring together communities or members of a community, they often will always have a solution to any problem. And I mentioned the theory of change earlier on. It's really just a tool that enables you to bring different stakeholders at community level to really decide on what the priorities are. And this is how we integrate Friendship Bench in communities across the world. At the moment, we are getting on average 6 to 10 requests every month from different parts of the world to introduce Friendship Bench. Our team is very small. We're only 16 people, and so we have to have a very rigid criteria, to decide who we focus on, who do we work with. But one of the entry points is that theory of change. Of course, we start off with what we call a situational analysis. You understand the context where you want to take this intervention, and then you go to the theory of change, and then we introduce our training of trainers. We then go on to train the grandmothers, and then we pilot. So there are 5 key steps that we take. But the key thing is community. Everything has to be embedded and driven by the community.
I think here with the microphone, and then
Yeah.
we'll go next over there. Okay.
Hi, my name's Catherine Martin. I'm from Nova Scotia, and I have all these basket makers beside me. And I don't know if it's a question, but there is a bit of a question at the end. In our community, women and grandmothers and aunties are everybody's. We get to call everybody an auntie, and that just speaks to the extended family system that was so strong until colonization. And over the years, with all the interference of colonized approaches and ways and forcing us to, not have that community-based connection, we've disconnected with, the youth have disconnected with the elders because a lot of them don't have any elders in their family or for all kinds of colonized reasons, taking them out of our communities, fostering them out of our culture and residential schools and 60 Scoop, all of those reasons there's been a disconnect. And not only is it important for the children to connect, but for the grandmothers and the grandfathers and the aunties to reconnect, to learn what is their role, what was their role, and to feel that they can contribute to society. In my community, we have a very strong male-dominated council government. Always has been, and I don't know if will ever change. When our grandmothers said, our children need a lunch program, we want to feed them when they come home for lunch because they're not getting their lunch at school, a good meal. Well, within a year, the program was wonderful. Everybody, the grandmothers came, they cooked for the children, and then the council said, we don't need that. Children can get their own money and get their food at school. And that was such a strong way to begin to have, you could identify who's having a trouble, who's having problems. And another time I brought Raging Grannies, who are grandmothers who, all around the world, but this group helps grandmothers to learn about being activists by being grannies. And our band council they sent people to monitor us because there was such fear of the grandmothers gathering together, which is a very colonized, patriarchal Indian Act law that we are not to gather and speak about politics or about organizing. So I just wanted to say that a lot of us are working in our communities to reconnect and to give the grandmothers and the grandfathers their rights back, their position in our community, instead of it being taken away by the colonized approach to government. And that is a way of us catching the young people who are having difficulty and the older people who are having difficulty, and to collectively come together. And just working with them in basket making, you're making baskets, but you're talking and you're sharing. We have a program now that youth can go and get a little funding to have 1,000 hours of language training from anyone in the community. I think a huge part of what has happened to our community with the highest rate of suicide in this country is that we've lost our relationship and our connection, both the young and the old. So I think your bench is fantastic. I just wonder, you've already told us, but how do we get those benches? We probably could find the funding to get those benches, but how do you get those benches and where do they go? Because you would get inundated with policy and law and, oh, that's not a good thing. What if they don't know what they're doing? They could hurt the people. And, how do you get through that? You're just saying, just simply put a bench there.
I think we were talking about, the reality of needing a double-blinded control study to convince some of the decision makers. And so I think it's acknowledging the reality of who are the decision makers in different contexts and what do they need to be convinced, unfortunately. And I'm not saying we shouldn't also change who are the decision makers and what it is that they're asking for, but if we're talking on the other side of the ledger, who are the decision makers and what do they need to be convinced? In the context that we're working often in global health, it is often the Ministry of Health in the country or localized decision makers around health decisions. And some of the stuff they need is evidence, which is why we supported this trial, so that they could check their box and say, oh, it's proven, and the training is proven, and the systems will be systematized. We're going to roll this out. And so I guess my advice is to figure out what are the power dynamics in your community, and who are the decision makers you need to convince, and what do they need to be convinced. And then working with partners on how to build that case to get it through. Separately, you want to change those dynamics, but today that's what we've seen work and what the Friendship Bench has successfully proven. So if it's helpful and you want to bring the Friendship Bench to your community, you can use the paper and you can learn from the training and the teaching and implement that, and maybe you'll convince the decision makers. That's what we've seen in the innovations that have scaled.
Yeah, just to add on to that briefly, that's exactly what they did in New York City. They essentially looked at our publication and they used that to convince the New York City Health Department that this was worth trying. And they tried it out and it's running.
So we'll take another question at the back there.
Thank you very much. My name's Bridget Sleep. I'm from HelpAge International. A common thread through many of the interventions that we've heard about is of reciprocity. So following on a little bit from the last speaker, what have the grandmothers said that they have found useful and beneficial from being part of this program? And have you measured that in your and shown the impact?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We were always concerned that the grandmothers, would end up suffering, from burnout and all sorts of things from doing this work. And my colleague, Ruth, who's a clinical psychologist, actually, her PhD was on was really looking at the effect of Friendship Bench on the grandmothers. And interestingly, the results showed that the grandmothers who were working on Friendship Bench had much lower rates of common mental disorders, things like depression, PTSD, and physical conditions as compared to matched controls from the community. So in terms of the health benefits, the grandmothers are doing much better, spending time sitting on the bench talking to people. And the qualitative research that we carried out seems to hint that, it's all about altruism. The grandmothers get a sense of purpose from doing this work, which actually gives them a sense of belonging. We've been talking about belonging here. Elderly people in most communities often feel excluded, isolated. But because of this bench work, they feel a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Just a few weeks ago, one of the grandmothers that I had been working with for more than 10 years passed away, and I had the opportunity of spending the last few hours with her at her house. And one of the things she said to me was, the Friendship Bench has given me a sense of purpose. And for me, that really gives me the confidence that this is something that I still need to carry on doing.
My name's Loretta Claiborne, and my question is to you. If a grandmother was sitting at the bench and I had a bad day, say, for instance, somebody died in my family, and I got a double whammy for that one day, would I be able to walk up on that and sit on that bench and talk to that grandmother about my problem?
Yes, you would. You definitely would. And, you just go to the bench and you sit, and grandma will be there. And the first thing that grandmothers always say, would you like to share your story with me?
Well,
That's
thank you,
how it
because I know
starts.
this is working in the schools in the States. It's been for many years in the schools. with young people. We know it's proven fact that it does work. So I'm just glad to hear, and I think it's a great idea that if I have that one-day problem, because that one day, that one shock in the day can make a difference.
Yeah,
By
that's so
talking to
true.
that grandmother. It doesn't
Yeah.
not have to be a lifelong mental illness.
Yeah.
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. Just last week, I was listening to Dr. Chibanda on NPR with this whole program, and it really struck me, and I'm very familiar with the Canadian Fund. Let me tell you a few of the things that it really sparked in me when I listened to you on the radio. One is that, and I also knew I was coming to Toronto, where the work of Stephen Lewis working with grandmothers on HIV is very well known in Africa as well. I thought to myself that maybe there's a possibility here of something that can be done that is not so constrained with research findings, that it can use research as a way to give us some information, but it doesn't have to be so attached to it that we consider its failure or success as a research thing. The reason I say is that we experiment with so much things, especially when we are thinking of successful things that happen in Africa, that they remain at the trial level. And their success gets killed by someone saying it did not fit the research results. But here, just listening to what you were saying on NPR and today, I just see like potentials that are immense. I was very pleased that you called it the friendship bench rather than the grandmothers, because then it really means that as you continue to work on this with several of us that are going to join you, or have
You're most welcome.
or have already joined you, maybe many people will find that this is the space that they could be to do something extra using the skills or the talents that they have. So I found it really good. I also found it good because I thought, right now, in my other life, where I have been working in the area of philanthropy, the issue is that currently, the grandmothers of the world, including here in North America, are the ones with resources. Because they worked so hard, they have the resources, they can, the grandfathers and the grandmothers, really take this to scale to assist funders such as the ones that are already on. If you go, I've been fundraising, but really the people who have the money right today are the grandparents of the world as individuals. On something like this, there's another way to get the scale. And the third thing that I got out of it, and you can see I was thinking about it because it is the time when I personally am rewiring, not retiring, thinking different ways in which I can continue to be useful in the world after so many years of working in these areas. And I feel like the issue with grandmothers alone, and I have been told by those that have been grandmothers before me, I am a grandmother now, that when they use the term grandmothers, the world calls them that they don't know. I'm from Kenya. I'm told by people who have been grandmothers just before me, when they go to, for example, a medical place, people start to ask, Mama, unajua? Meaning, old lady, do you know this? Even if they have been their professors, they start to talk down on them. So this is the part that probably my question would have been, how are you managing that aspect? Because a lot of people talk down on older people, even when the older people might have wisdom. And sometimes the older people give the wisdom, and the people listen to it, but sometimes they say, but it was an old man, it was an old woman.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this work has been going on for over 10 years. So the grandmothers were not accepted immediately when we started. It took quite a bit of work because we now have a critical mass of grandmothers, and there's so much talk about the friendship bench and this realization at national level that grandmothers have a role to play, not only in health, in the delivering of health programs, but also in maintaining and retaining that culture and creating stability within communities. So it's a process. And I think because it's a process, we have to consistently be working on it, and so that's what we've been doing. But, the surprising thing is, whether we are in Zanzibar, and, we recently were in Kericho, in Kenya, we're seeing the same kind of outcome in terms of bringing on board grandmothers. Grandmothers are a lot more, embracing and welcoming. I know some of you might ask, why not grandfathers? We tried grandfathers. We tried grandfathers. We did. I mean, I'm male after all. I'm a man. I want to see grandfathers doing this work. But, the problem is grandfathers tend to be very instructive. They tell you what you need to do, whereas the friendship bench is all about creating space. And if you're going to create space, you have to let people tell their stories. And oftentimes we find that grandfathers are not patient enough to let clients tell or share their stories. But we are working with grandfathers too, but in different ways. But the bench, the most powerful people on the bench are our grandmothers.
Okay, we'll take
One last question.
Yeah.
Okay.
one last question, and then we'll close this off. Sir.
I'm Reynold Morris, and just building on the grandfather story, I just wanted to find out, has your model dealt with the gender dynamic in terms of how many men are coming forward to make use of the friendship bench to share their problems with the grannies?
So that's a good question. Because originally when we started, the friendship bench was embedded within clinics. And as you know from research, women tend to visit primary care clinics more than men. But as the benches go out, we are getting more men coming to the bench. So it's not even about gender. Men will gladly and happily sit at a bench with a grandmother. As long as it's a grandmother, as long as it's an elderly woman, it's okay. But if it's a young woman, they will not open up, Yeah.
Well, I think we'll close it off because we're out of time. I hope you'll join me in thanking Dixon for his leadership and
Thank you.